World War I, myths versus reality. World War I is often remembered through enrooted images passed down through generations, endless trenches, heroic gestures, and senseless slaughter that obscure the complexity and nuance of reality. We often forget that the world of the time was not black and white, and that the experiences of different fronts, soldiers, and civilians could vary dramatically. That's why we're going to bust some of the most persistent myths about the First World War, and show that the truth may be quite different than it seems at first glance. One of the most common myths is that machine guns were the deadliest weapon of World War I. The image of soldiers going over the top and being mowed down by heavy machine gun fire is deeply rooted in popular culture. But the reality is different. The most lethal weapon of the First World War was artillery. Historical research and statistics show that artillery shells caused the vast majority of deaths on all major fronts. For instance, estimates for the Western Front suggest that up to 70 to 75% of all British and French casualties were due to artillery fire. Some German sources report even higher figures, up to 77%. Late-war American statistics attribute around 2/3 of injuries and deaths to artillery. The reasons for this are clear. Artillery had become an industrialized killing machine. During major offensives, millions of shells were fired. At the Battle of the Somme in 1916, for example, the British fired over 1.5 million shells in the first 5 days of bombardment. At Verdun, the total exceeded 22 million shells. Artillery didn't just kill, its shrapnel caused horrific injuries even to those in cover, and the constant explosions led to psychological trauma, known as shell shock. In contrast, machine guns, though devastating in defensive situations, accounted for a smaller proportion of battlefield deaths, estimated at 25 to 35%, including rifles and handguns. Trench warfare became the symbol of World War I. Wet, dirty, claustrophobic, and deadly, the popular image is that soldiers spent years in frontline trenches without relief. But this isn't entirely true. Most armies, especially the British and French, implemented rotation systems to manage logistics and maintain morale. A typical British infantryman's cycle included 4 to 6 days in the front line, followed by time in support trenches, reserve zones, and then rest areas. On average, a British soldier spent only about 15% of his time in the actual front line. About 10% was spent in support trenches, 30% in reserve zones, 20% on rest, and the rest on transport, training, or in medical facilities. There were exceptions, such as the Australian 31st Battalion, which spent 53 days straight in the front line, or the Portuguese Expeditionary Corps, which due to lack of reinforcements held the line for 6 months. But these cases were unusual. Trench life was still brutal, cold, wet, and unsanitary. Soldiers suffered from trench foot, lice, and disease, and contended with giant rats feeding on corpses. Conditions were grim, but constant frontline exposure was rare. The Christmas truce is often romanticized, with images of enemies singing carols, exchanging gifts, and playing football. While elements of this did happen, the reality is more complex. The truce was spontaneous and localized. It began on Christmas Eve, when German soldiers lit candles, decorated trees, and sang Stille Nacht. British troops responded with their own carols, and in some sectors, men ventured into no man's land to exchange gifts and bury the dead. An estimated 100,000 men may have participated. There were even informal football matches, although these were more like playful kick-arounds, using a tin can or similar, rather than formal games. But not all sectors joined the truce. In many areas, fighting continued as usual, and soldiers trying to fraternize were sometimes shot. Allied commanders, such as General Horace Smith Dorrien, were outraged and issued strict bans on further contact with the enemy. On the German side, one soldier famously condemned the truce as dishonorable. That soldier's name? Adolf Hitler. Although we now correctly refer to the conflict as World War I, this name was not used during the war itself. Between 1914 and 1918, people commonly referred to the conflict as the Great War, or simply the World War, because no one could yet imagine that another global war of similar scale would follow. The term First World War only came into common use after 1939, when the Second World War broke out and historians and the public needed a way to distinguish between the two. However, calling it a world war was entirely justified. The fighting truly spanned the globe, taking place not only in Europe, but also in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, or the oceans. The conflict involved major powers from 5 continents, including Britain, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia, the United States, Japan, and the Ottoman Empire. Colonial troops from India, Africa, Australia, and Canada also fought. So in terms of global impact, the title World War is entirely appropriate. While most associate World War I with male soldiers, women played key roles, not only in support roles, but even in combat, particularly in Russia, Serbia, Romania, and Bulgaria. The most famous example is the Russian Women's Battalion of Death, founded in 1917 by Maria Boshkareva, a peasant woman from Siberia. She had already been fighting since 1914 and had earned several medals for bravery. After the February Revolution in Russia, she received permission from Alexander Kerensky, the Minister of War and Navy, to form an all-female combat unit. The idea was not only to support the defense of Russia, but also to boost morale among demoralized male troops. Out of more than 2,000 volunteers, around 300 women completed the tough training and were sent to the front during the Kerensky offensive. They fought near Smorgon in present-day Belarus, where they managed to capture several enemy trenches and briefly halt German advances, even as many male soldiers retreated. However, their bravery was often met with mockery or discomfort by male soldiers, and General Kornilov later banned women from serving in combat. By the end of 1917, the unit was disbanded. Some women continued to fight in the Russian Civil War, while others became victims of Bolshevik purges. In other countries, women fought disguised as men, such as Natalie Tishminy or Olga Krasilnikova, both of whom were decorated for bravery. Although World War I is often described as the deadliest conflict of its time, this isn't entirely accurate. The war caused approximately 15 to 20 million deaths, both military and civilian, and had global political and social consequences. But other historical conflicts had higher death tolls. For instance, the Taiping Rebellion in China in 1850 to 1864 resulted in 20 to 30 million deaths, with some estimates going as high as 50 million. Most casualties were civilians, who died from fighting, famine, disease, and social collapse. In British history, World War I resulted in about 886,000 British military deaths, the highest of any conflict in absolute terms. But in relative terms, the English Civil War of the 17th century was even more devastating. Between 1642 and 1651, 4% of the English and Welsh population died. In Ireland, losses reached 15 to 20%, and some estimates suggest up to 40% of the population was lost due to famine, disease, and violence. For comparison, about 2.2% of Britain's population died in World War I. Officially, the United States declared neutrality in 1914. President Woodrow Wilson urged Americans to be neutral in thought and deed. The US only entered the war in April 1917, nearly 3 years later. But in reality, America's neutrality was far from absolute. Public sympathy and political inclination largely favored the Allies, especially Britain and France. Cultural ties to Britain and reports of German atrocities in Belgium swayed public opinion. Even before joining the war, American industry and banks were deeply involved. Factories produced weapons and ammunition, mostly for Britain and France. Banks like JP Morgan lent billions to the Allies, effectively making them dependent on US support. There was also humanitarian aid. In 1914, Herbert Hoover led the Commission for Relief in Belgium, supplying food and essentials to civilians in German-occupied regions. He later ran the US Food Administration, promoting conservation campaigns like Meatless Mondays and Wheatless Wednesdays. The tipping point came in 1917, when Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, targeting all ships, including civilian ones. Then came the infamous Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany proposed an alliance with Mexico, promising to help it reclaim lost US territory. That was too much. Wilson asked Congress to declare war, and the United States entered World War I on the side of the Allies. It is often said that World War I mostly affected working-class soldiers, while the sons of wealthy and powerful families were spared. But this view is not entirely accurate. In reality, young men from the upper classes, especially those who had studied at elite schools like Eton, frequently served as officers and were often the first to go over the top. Because of this, their risk of death was higher than that of the average soldier. While about 12% of British enlisted men died in the war, officer casualty rates reached up to 17%. These young officers were responsible for leading their men into no man's land, making them the most exposed. For example, the prestigious Eton College lost over 1,000 former pupils, representing about 20% of those who fought. Other elite schools suffered similar losses. Even the political elite was not spared. British Prime Minister Herbert Asquith lost a son. His successor, Andrew Bonar Law, lost 2 sons. Future Prime Minister Anthony Eden lost 2 brothers. A third was badly wounded, and their uncle was taken prisoner. Senior officers and generals also faced real danger. Several dozen British generals were killed or captured during the war, a reminder that even high-ranking commanders face the frontline risks. Another common myth is that tactics on the Western Front remained unchanged throughout the war. Generals repeatedly sending soldiers to run into machine gun fire in futile assaults. But in reality, World War I saw one of the most rapid evolutions in military tactics and technology in modern history. At the war's start in 1914, armies used 19th century strategies: commanders on horseback, infantry moving in lines, and weapons largely limited to bolt-action rifles with bayonets. There was poor coordination between infantry and artillery, and limited communications. But by 1918, everything had changed. Soldiers now had steel helmets, light machine guns, grenades, and even flamethrowers. The armies implemented combined arms tactics, coordinating infantry, artillery, tanks, and air support. Artillery accuracy improved dramatically thanks to aerial reconnaissance, photography, and mathematical targeting. One key innovation was the creeping barrage, where artillery fire moved slowly forward just ahead of advancing troops, offering protection as they advanced, replacing long bombardments that only alerted the enemy. The first tanks were deployed in 1915 prototypes, and by 1917 were used on a larger scale, playing an important role in breaking trench stalemates despite early mechanical issues. Air power also evolved rapidly. Aircraft initially used for scouting became capable of bombing, reconnaissance, and dogfights. By 1918, some planes had radio transmitters for real-time communication with ground troops. New units, like German Sturmtruppen, or stormtroopers, used flexible tactics with speed, grenades, and light weapons to infiltrate and disrupt enemy lines, foreshadowing modern maneuver warfare. It is often claimed that nobody won World War I because of the immense suffering, destruction, and disillusionment. But from a military and political perspective, Germany was clearly defeated, and the Allies, especially Britain, France, and later the USA, won. By late 1918, Germany's navy had collapsed. Sailors refused orders for suicide missions, leading to mutiny, sabotage, and widespread unrest. In spring 1918, Germany launched a major offensive that initially succeeded, but soon stalled due to lack of reinforcements and supplies. The Allied counteroffensive in summer and fall was decisive. On August 8, 1918, British commander Douglas Haig called it the Black Day of the German Army, as German forces began to collapse en masse. Even General Ludendorff admitted by September that the war was lost. A revolution broke out in Germany. Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated, and the German Empire fell. On November 11, 1918, Germany signed an armistice. Although it was officially a ceasefire, it was effectively a surrender, without Berlin being captured. While Britain and France bore the war's burden, the entry of the USA in 1917 tipped the balance. The arrival of millions of fresh American troops, alongside vast quantities of weapons, food, and fuel, broke Germany's resistance. Thus, the Allies won. But the cost was so high that the victory felt hollow to many. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, is often portrayed as an extremely harsh and unjust peace that inflicted such suffering on Germany that it gave rise to Nazism and World War II. But this is a simplified view that does not fully reflect historical reality. Although the treaty did impose serious restrictions, it was not exceptionally harsh when compared to other peace treaties, and certainly not destructive. Germany lost about 13% of its pre-war territory and roughly 10 to 12% of its population. It lost Alsace-Lorraine, parts of Silesia, Poznan, the Hluchine region, and all its colonies. Still, it remained the largest and economically strongest country in Central Europe. Military restrictions were strict. Germany was banned from having an air force, tanks, or submarines, and its army was limited to 100,000 men. The Rhineland was demilitarized. However, Germany was not occupied as it was after World War II, nor was it divided, its infrastructure destroyed, or its population forcibly relocated or expropriated. The reparations, set at 132 billion gold marks, are infamous. But in practice, they were reduced and often postponed, through agreements like the Dawes Plan and the Young Plan, which spread out payments over time. By 1932, the payments had effectively stopped, and Germany had paid only a fraction of the original amount. Compared to the peace imposed by Prussia on France in 1871, or the treatment of Germany after World War II, Versailles was not exceptionally severe. In 1871, Germany annexed Alsace-Lorraine and demanded huge immediate reparations. After World War II, Germany was divided, occupied, deindustrialized, and millions of Germans were expelled from their homes. Still, in interwar Germany, Versailles became a symbol of national humiliation. Hitler and the Nazis used it in their propaganda, calling it a dictated peace that Germany never voluntarily signed and which plunged it into misery. Historians agree that the treaty was not excessively harsh, but rather a flawed compromise. It wasn't strict enough to permanently prevent German aggression, nor lenient enough to avoid fostering resentment. World War I caused immense suffering. Many soldiers died, others were physically or mentally wounded for life. PTSD was common, and recovery resources were lacking. However, the experience of war varied greatly. Some soldiers, depending on their assignment and timing, experienced relatively quiet deployments. Not all front lines were equally deadly. Some resembled long patrol duty more than constant horror. In quieter sectors, soldiers enjoyed relative safety, camaraderie, and steady supplies. For example, British troops were served meat almost daily. a rare luxury compared to civilian life, along with cigarettes, tea, and rum, often totaling 4,000 calories a day. Rum was used to boost morale and reduce stress, issued morning and evening, and as a reward for bravery. Historical data shows that absentee rates, due to illness or injury, were not higher than peacetime, suggesting that military life offered stability, bonds, and structure many lacked at home. Some men valued the steady income, sense of purpose, and even a feeling of freedom away from rigid civilian norms. Yes, the danger, trauma, and death were real and constant for many. But war also included moments of relief, humanity, and small joys, especially when soldiers managed to avoid the worst combat. And that's it from us on Common Myths about World War I. Which one surprised you the most? Do you know of another myth we missed? Let us know in the comments, and thank you so much for choosing to watch our video.